It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you on this auspicious and very significant occasion for the University of Johannesburg, the Professorial Inauguration of Professor Kammila Naidoo, Head of the Department of Sociology in the Faculty of Humanities. In particular, I'd like to welcome Professor Naidoo's family, and many of them are in the audience this evening. A warm welcome to each and every one of you. I'd also like to take this opportunity to welcome our colleagues from our sister universities, the Wits University, UNISA, Pretoria University, and to all the members of the Faculty of Humanities at UJ and to other UJ colleagues as well. A professorial inauguration as the one we will be participating in today is a truly significant occasion in the life of any university. It represents the formal induction of a senior member of faculty into the ranks of the academic professoriate. The noun professor, as many of you might know, derives originally from the Latin word profiteri, pro meaning before, and fateri, to confess. Thus, the original Roman meaning is to confess before the public. In the late Middle Ages, the term professor was used to refer to university teachers of the highest order, while the act was no longer a confession, rather a declaration and an exposition of one's academic discipline. The very public nature of the event remains entrenched. It is and always has been the opportunity for an eminent scholar to explain the principles, procedures, and objects of one's scholarly gaze to one's peers, members of the public, and to one's family. The act of professing was a prelude to the conferring of the title of professor. The title conferred upon very few and requires that one is acknowledged and is known for one's work and is also preeminent in one's field of scholarly inquiry. This elite group comprises the Senate, and because medieval universities were communities, the towns in which they were situated were essentially extensions of the universities, providing civic services. The Senate, therefore, largely controlled the towns as well. Fortunately, modern-day professors do not have to function as city councillors. There's also more to the history. Professors frequently hold chairs in their disciplines. The medieval origins of the chair are also Islamic in origin. The Caliph himself would appoint a kursi or a chair in the university or madrasa. The appointment was normally for life, and the chairholder would literally sit in a chair surrounded by students. The kursi, like the professor, was highly esteemed and for good reasons. Perhaps the most shining example of Islamic learning in Africa was the establishment of the University of Timbuktu in Mali in the 12th century. 9 centuries ago, this seat of learning had 25,000 students from Africa and the Mediterranean. So from two distinct medieval university traditions, one steeped in Islam and the other steeped in Christianity, an outstanding academic elite was established. The situation is no different today. As a leading institution of higher learning, the University of Johannesburg goes to great lengths to make professorial appointments that will ensure that the status and the quality of the university is maintained for the next generation and thereafter. Our professors are truly significant members of our university community. As members of Senate, they guide our decision-making around core academic efforts. They represent their disciplines both within and outside of the university, in academic contexts and in broader professional and social contexts. They offer academic leadership. They are responsible for nurturing the next generation of academics and supporting them as they mature into the next generation of scholars. And they ensure that we offer our students a quality learning experience. All of this, ladies and gentlemen, of course requires qualities in addition to the erudition which we primarily associate with being a professor. It requires professors and academic leaders who also show a human face, who combine academic leadership with concern and care for their colleagues and their students. And we know certainly that this is something in which Professor Naidoo does excel. With those few words, I wish to say that Professor Naidoo, we look forward to what will undoubtedly be a presentation of great erudition and scholarship. I now call upon the Executive Dean to introduce Professor Naidoo.
Professor Parekh, Professor Adeshina, and Professor Naidoo, executive directors, professors, colleagues, family of Professor Naidoo, and our guests who've come all the way to this occasion here. Allow me to introduce Professor Kammila Naidoo to you. Kammila Naidoo grew up in Durban and attended St. Anthony's Primary School, Durban High School, and finally in the last few years of high school, Reisenthorpe Secondary in Pietermaritzburg. Her BA Honours and Master's degrees in Sociology were completed at the University of Durban Westville campus, UDW campus, a predecessor of the Amalgamated University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa's final days of racially segregated university. She began lecturing at UDW, where she taught large numbers of restless undergraduates and developed a strong interest in teaching philosophies alongside her core sociological concerns, the study of family and household dynamics, and the changing politics of, inverted commas, communities in transition. Shortly after completing her master's degree, she left for Pretoria, where she joined the sociology department at the University of South Africa as a lecturer. There she became acquainted with the art of distance education and the challenges of multilingualism, offering tuition through the written mode and meeting tight production deadlines. Her earliest publications capture some of her enthusiasm for creative and socially innovative teaching methodologies and for accessible institutional environments to encourage substantive learning. At UNISA, she worked within the sociology department's family group, chaired initially by the feminist sociologist Sylvia Viljoen. She frequently thinks back fondly to the vigorous debates and discussions that often took place in the family group. For example, about the state of family theory or the challenges posed by oscillating migration. Kammila took sabbatical leave to go to the United Kingdom in 1997. She was fortunate to receive a Commonwealth scholarship to study full-time towards a PhD in sociology from 1998 to 2000. The scholarship took her to the sociology department at the University of Manchester, where she joined the development studies group headed by Giovanni Sandeli. Scholars such as Colin Murray, Paul Carmack, Phil Woodhouse, Angela Dale, and Mark Brown were active members of this team and served as major influences on the largely international graduate students during PhDs at the time. Her thesis, supervised by Murray and Dale, drew on demographic and sociological theoretical arguments in assessing shifting patterns of family and marriage in South Africa. From this exploration, she produced a monograph and various publications. Kammila has recently received an NRF grant for 2014 and 2015 to develop aspects of this work further. In 2002, Kammila left UNISA to join the University of Pretoria. The Department of Sociology at UP was at the time targeted for transformation, and Kammila joined Janus Grobelaar in a quest to build a new vision for the department, including a critical core of postgraduate students, as well as new curricula and research agendas. At UP, she coordinated the interdisciplinary gender studies program run by the sociology department. Along with Janus, she also managed a mega project on poverty and inequality, studying poor households across all racial groups in and around Tshwane. In 2007, Kammila became an external collaborator in Tina Uys and Sujata Patel's Social Capital Project. Together with colleagues at the University of Johannesburg, she developed what she considers to be new thinking on family capital, gendered citizenship, and middle-class challenges associated with mediating academic work and family life. After officially joining the University of Johannesburg in September 2010, Kammila has worked closely with the members of her department on a range of projects, including what has been simply referred to as the Student Communities Project, initiated and led by Professor Tina Uys. Through this project, the Sociology Department, in collaboration with scholars from Hyderabad, India, have sought to understand the various identities of youth, including their changing politics, lifestyles, academic achievements, socio-economic challenges, sexuality, and family backgrounds. The fruits of this project are the subject of a special issue on contested youth identities, due to be published later this year. Kammila has produced 2 monographs and about 35 sole or co-authored publications over the years. She has supervised to completion or examined about 65 honours, masters and doctoral dissertations. She has been the head of UJ's Sociology Department since 2013 and is part of the editorial collective of the South African Review of Sociology. She would like to take this opportunity to thank all her colleagues, past and present, in the sociology departments of UNISA, Manchester, UP and UJ for their support and friendship over the years. Perhaps the 2 people whom she considers to have been most instrumental in shaping her role as a sociologist and a teacher would be Janus Grobelaar at UP and the late Colin Murray. She credits Sylvia Viljoen for sparking her interest in issues related to reproduction and family life many years ago, and Sylvia and Jan Pretorius for offering her her first permanent post. She would also like to extend her deepest thanks to members of her extended family present here today, especially Jayendra, Milani and Ravi, and her mother Sana, who was her first advisor on the complexities of family life. And may I, as acting dean, also say that we appreciate your collegiality and your dedication to your work. With those words then, over to you.
I'd firstly like to thank all my colleagues, friends, family, and many of my students for being here this evening. I appreciate your presence, and a special thanks to those who've come from outside of Johannesburg, Pretoria, and the Northwest Province. I'm really pleased to see you. My topic is alternative sub-narratives in social demography towards augmenting gender in the study of family dynamics in South Africa. And this is how I begin. In 1996, renowned Dutch scholar Dirk van der Kar argued that demographers seem to resemble judges in a court of law, in that contrary to what we might expect, they're usually not in the habit of constructing accounts of what actually happened in the social world. They assemble blocks of evidence that are available and then opt for a certain narrative of what transpired, making efforts to anchor the narrative in the evidence and in common knowledge about the way things are expected to happen. In so doing, they do not necessarily probe all the elements of the story, and on occasion they may fail to question some points which are highly implausible, inconsistent, or ambiguous. Van der Kaar's point in seeking to draw attention to how demographers promote and anchor dominant narratives was that if the global story of fertility transition and family formation was to be fully appreciated, academics will have to engage in more robust interrogation and scrutiny of the series of sub-narratives reflecting differing disciplinary perspectives and orientations that are currently in vogue. So my lecture today focuses on the need to build critical and alternative perspectives, or sub-narratives, which can offer new and gendered insights on macro-level changing demographic patterns, as well as the complexities of lived experiences of families in selected micro-settings. My particular interest for a number of years has been on people's struggles with poverty and deteriorating socioeconomic conditions, and how encounters with and perceptions of adversity and related factors might ultimately influence the nature of fertility transition in particular social environments. In this sense, I've sought to show how microdemographic studies of fertility can complement or offer deeper understandings of the numerous issues influencing women's lives that ultimately shape their reproductive histories. The bulk of my evidence comes from 16 years of continuing ethnographic work within a fieldwork site in the Winterfell area north of Pretoria. Through resilient long-term fieldwork, I see considerable potential for expanded and nuanced analysis of the gendered and the intimate, the long-established and day-to-day, leading to textured understandings of larger shifting familial and demographic patterns. To probe the forces driving current changes in birth rates and desires for children, we must necessarily delve into questions of power, violence, inequity, and the struggle for resources. Thus, social demographic projects are political in nature and remind us that politics is played out not only in public arenas at the macro-structural institutional level, in law, policy, governance, and media, but equally in moments and spaces that pertain to the most personal and mundane aspects of the lives of ordinary people. To tease out and anchor sub-narratives in this broad and challenging field, the role of gender in demographic processes has to be illuminated and augmented as a necessary and critical endeavor. Until the 1960s, the demographic transition theory remained the dominant paradigm in demography. In Population: The Long View, Frank Notenstein put forward the view that fertility transition took place in stages accompanying the processes of modernization and industrialization. He maintained that countries with underdeveloped economies were hindered by constraints which kept fertility high, but that in time they would follow the trend of European countries that experienced incipient mortality and fertility decline. Just as modernization theory predicted the unilinear routes of social change which all societies would follow, from traditional to modern forms, demographic transition theory suggested that European countries had followed the stages of fertility transition that the rest of the developing world would follow as the modernizing processes unfolded. About 20 years of investigation by Ansley Cole and his team, based at the Princeton University European Fertility Project, however, resulted in the eventual undermining of this model. It was concluded that historical evidence did not support the claim that the forces associated with modernization were the propellants of fertility decline. Instead, broadly defined cultural variables such as language, religious affiliation, and women's education were found to impact more significantly on the timing and rate of fertility decline. With the loss of confidence in demographic transition theory, alternative explanations such as those linked to diffusionism and ideational change, and the new household economics arguments linking demand for children to costs and prices grew in popularity. An exhaustive overview of contending and contesting positions is not possible here. It might, however, be important to note that while the assumptions of structural change of classic transition theory were superseded by more micro-level and household-based analysis, these were still located within the framework of modernist arguments about rational decision-making on family size and the roles of knowledge, modern values, and new technologies and their contribution to declining fertility rates. What continued to be missing was more meaningful and complex treatment of women or gender in the demographic literature. While statistics on women became increasingly available, the emphasis initially was largely on descriptions of women's role and women's status, notwithstanding the fact that both concepts were being severely criticized within feminist discourse. More crucial shortcomings, though, relate to the fact that reproductive behavior and fertility outcomes were rarely studied within the context of power inequalities at the societal and domestic level, or as a consequence of conflicting gender interests. Nor was it common to see efforts of situating fertility, that is, to indicate how it should be understood given the socio-cultural and political context in which it is entrenched. Some of the alternative explanations in the 1970s, however, did begin to integrate issues of gender and power in the analytical domain, and the most important of these, and of relevance for sub-Saharan Africa, was arguably John Caldwell's restatement of demographic transition theory. For Caldwell, the main issue when considering demographic transition in Africa was the direction and magnitude of intergenerational wealth flows from children to parents or from younger to older generations. In this view, it is rational to maintain high levels of fertility if children make productive contributions to the household economy. Conversely, when children become costly and there are fewer productive gains to be derived from having large families, a decline in fertility and change in household and familial structure occurs. Caldwell's work is often contrasted with Mead Keynes' work on children as potential sources of social security. Keynes claims that women's dependence on men and their awareness of their own vulnerability in situations of partnership dissolution leads them to desire large numbers of children themselves. Additionally, unlike Caldwell, Keynes does not regard the nucleation of family structure as synonymous with fertility decline. He maintains that strong and extended kin networks may in certain circumstances be more important as alternative source of support and insurance than do large numbers of children. When children are deemed to be less significant in shielding people against risk and hardship, women will be more likely to have fewer children, and society will be less resistant to fertility decline. African reproductive regimes have been commonly discussed as fertility maximizing regimes, reflecting universal marriage, large families, resistance to family planning, and strong desires for large numbers of children. In the 1990s, however, signs of declining fertility in sub-Saharan African countries raised questions about many of the preconceived notions about African fertility, marriage, and family life. Debate raged about the particularities of fertility transition in sub-Saharan Africa and the extent to which fertility regimes there were beginning to transform in line with trends followed by the rest of the world, and this led to the revival of transition theory arguments. At the same time, assessments of the success of development initiatives, literacy, media messages, imported technologies, and the role of modernizing institutions in these transitions became the central foci of attention. Robinson, for example, spoke optimistically about changes occurring in Kenya. He argued that couples in Kenya were becoming concerned about ideal family size. He linked this change to the process of modernization and argued that Kenyan society found itself in collision with customs promoting pronatalism, health, immunization, and development programs. Health, immunization, and development programs were improving child survival rates, and the cost of having children was increasing. At the same time, contraception was becoming cheaper and more easily obtainable. Robinson inferred that with the continuation of these interventions, alongside the modernization of Kenya, fertility would continue to decline. Similarly, with regard to shifting regimes in Botswana, Gaizi noted, Botswana's experience shows that a firm economic base, providing a sustainably adequate standard of living for the people, and a well-organized family planning program can to a large extent narrow the gap between fertility and mortality. With respect to the South African transition, Caldwell and Caldwell drew on social capillary arguments and suggested that fertility decline was modest during the apartheid era because South Africa was a caste society with black people restricted from climbing occupational ladders. They proposed that post-apartheid South Africa would witness significant shifts in fertility as a consequence of general improvements in living conditions and socioeconomic opportunities, particularly for women. While the dominant arguments continue to reiterate the crucial role of macro-level socioeconomic development in fertility transition, little attention has been paid to the intersecting influences of, for example, the effects of persisting economic insecurities, inequality, recurring political protests in peri-urban areas, and to less popular positions such as those put forward by Ron Listager. Listager posed an interesting but speculative question about the possible initiation of a crisis-led fertility decline in African countries that were experiencing the effects of severe economic downturns, natural disasters, and the shaking of aspirations. This was, in a sense, a muted and not very popular argument. However, I found it extremely attractive and thought it deserved much more attention in the course of my own fieldwork. Listager's point was that fertility transitions might well be occurring in environments where living conditions do not appear to be improving. That is in contrast to the conventional wisdom of demographic transition theory, which connects a fertility transition to increased prosperity and advancing structural transformation. He suggested that while there are many cases of short-term declines in fertility in response to hardship, there are few indications of sustained crisis-led fertility transitions. He surmised that poor socioeconomic conditions in Africa might place enormous pressure on families and individual women to reduce the number of children they bear. Feminist demographers have attempted to probe the links between women's empowerment, domestic violence, and fertility decline in selected African contexts. In examining fertility decline in Kenya, Candice Bradley, for example, suggested that, paradoxically, the transition might be a result of women making gains on the one hand, but experiencing losses on the other. She suggests that alongside data that show increases in the number of women taking on formal work and acquiring higher levels of education, are statistics which indicate that violence against women has increased tremendously over the years. She argues that lower fertility may be due to domestic struggles, scarcity, and gender-based violence rather than popular notions of empowerment. Such an argument has relevance for South Africa, where sectors of the population have been experiencing deepening poverty, unemployment, and a lack of service delivery over the past few decades, and where levels of gender-based violence have increased. So what then should be acknowledged about the social circumstances of women in post-apartheid South Africa? Understanding the situation of women in any society requires paying close attention to the institutional and contextual parameters within which fertility is declining. So here's a snapshot of the social position of South African women today. Statistics South Africa suggests that the total fertility rate currently is 2.34 children per woman, with Gauteng and its surrounds falling as low as 1.87 for all groups of women. In 1998, the South African Demographic and Health Survey showed that the total fertility rate was 2.9, considerably lower than the 4.1 children per woman revealed in the earlier DHS. Although conceding that the direct and indirect determinants of fertility require further study in order to provide more conclusive research results, many demographers celebrate the progressive decline in fertility in South Africa as being linked to rising levels of women's education, urbanization, employment, and generally improved economic and health conditions.
Additionally, women's access to modern contraception, extensively improved as part of a political agenda during the apartheid era, has been cited as an extraordinarily significant moment in the empowerment of women. In the 1980s, South Africa's contraceptive prevalence rate was by far the highest in Africa, and this rate increased in the 1990s, and today about 65% of all sexually active women between the ages of 15 to 49 are using modern contraceptives. Are there positive shifts signifying improvements in women's position? The proportion of girls successfully completing their high school education has been consistently satisfactory over the years, and for some years, higher than that of boys. While many school pupils fail to complete high school, the majority who do pass are young women. The increasing number of women with higher levels of education implies in demographic logic that women have stronger abilities to negotiate childbearing with partners, have middle-class consciousness, have more frequent access to modern contraceptives, and use them readily to postpone or limit the number of children born. Working at cross purposes, however, is the high dropout rate. In general, less than half of the cohort that started grade 1 in 2002 sat for the matric exam in 2013. Keeping girls in school is potentially empowering, but school brings with it the not-so-hidden curriculum, learning how to contend with discriminatory practices, sexual harassment, rape and abuse. While the media and women's activist groups suggest that women, irrespective of class, race or age, are being subjected to increasing acts of violence and coercion, precise figures have been difficult to ascertain. What we do know, however, is that South Africa currently has the appalling reputation of being the rape capital of the world, exhibiting levels of rape on par with that of society in a state of war. The HSRC and Stats SA argued in 2001 that 30 to 70% of rapes are unreported. When South Africa's Domestic Violence Act came into being, 1 in 10 women reported being physically assaulted. By 2010, 1 in 5 in Gauteng reported intimate partner violence. In a survey conducted a few years ago, 4 in 10 South African men admitted that they had been physically violent with an intimate partner. The violence that many women experience from their early days at preschool to their mature granny years must surely be factored into macro-analysis of changing fertility and demographic patterns. And yet demographers really grapple with the significance of such experiences on women's lives and on a society's childbearing patterns and familial structures. Poverty remains a debilitating factor for many South African households and must also be seriously considered when examining changing reproductive decision-making and the desire for children. About 23 million people in South Africa live in poverty today, with 10.2 million of them enduring conditions of extreme poverty. A substantial number of households in South Africa remain heavily in debt and reliant on state welfare interventions. About 30% of all South Africans are without paid work, with the number of job seekers increasing rapidly since 1990. Young women under 25 are most urgently in need of work opportunities, with about 53% of them being unemployed. Women continue to encounter discriminatory practices and beliefs in some quarters that they're expendable because they are not regarded as breadwinners, notwithstanding the fact that women-headed households have become a strong feature of the South African familial landscape. The foregoing statistics suggest the coexistence of different realities. In one reality, reproductive rights and control over the number and timing of children born are being asserted more readily than in the past. On the other hand, there's a reality which suggests the fierce violation of these rights through experiences of domestic and sexual violence and persistent poverty. And these different realities also hint at general backlashes facing women on the African continent today. As Sylvia Tamale, the Ugandan feminist, maintains, today feminist activists around the continent are ironically fighting tooth and nail to halt the changes that are threatening to roll back hard-won gender equity gains and social progress. The persistent question then is, what actually actual progress has the last half century of development brought in terms of gender equality? And what does gender equality mean when translated to the everyday lives of women on the continent? I'd like to take you now to my fieldwork site and invite you to consider how intensive ethnographic work in a micro setting can aid the larger project of building a fitting sub-narrative in Southern African demography, and perhaps lend impetus to new and critical theory building on fertility and family life. In setting out to assemble meaningful insights on the construction of fertility and family life in a dynamic and resilient site, I settled on the Winterfell area as the place to begin research. Winterfell has been my research site since 1998. It is a sprawling peri-urban area about 40 kilometers north of Pretoria, within the ambit of both the Tshwane Unicity and the Northwest Province. It covers an expanse of roughly 100 square kilometers, which during the 1930s and 1940s was divided up into more than 1,000 plots of various sizes and sold to relatively prosperous black purchasers. Although the early landowners had hoped that the area would turn into profitable agricultural holdings, historical circumstances transformed it instead into a densely populated, infrastructurally underdeveloped, and extremely poverty-ridden informal settlement. Winterfell's socioeconomic troubles appear deep-seated and unrelenting, and as such, the area is always described in unfavorable terms. The area's status as a problem area persists alongside observations of growing unemployment, poor and unhealthy living conditions, political conflict, and the apparent growth of non-conventional livelihood strategies. The social existences of both landowners and tenants living in the area have been considerably challenged over the years by political repression and tensions, economic crisis, and increasing poverty. Hardship became particularly entrenched in the 1970s and 1980s, when the Bantustan government of Bophuthatswana took over jurisdiction of Winterfell and initiated a process of large-scale evictions and harassment of the non-Tswana sector of the population. Over the years, Winterfell's socio-political and economic marginalization appears to have remained unmitigated, and it is against this background of socio-economic disorganization and political dissension that we need to locate what I see as the gradual transformation of domestic units, the weakening of kin relations, and the disintegration of wider family structures and networks in Winterfell. Living with the constant threat of arrest in those difficult times forced many tenants into clandestine and insecure living and working arrangements. And these arrangements have had severe effects on the sustainability of conjugal unions, family relationships, and stability of households. The stories that I've captured in the area suggest that while the post-apartheid period has brought with it freedom from political harassment, the material deprivation and isolation of a socially disordered environment continue to keep relations tenuous and families apart. Women have been most vulnerable to these constraints and have endured fragile partnerships, abandonment, multiple dependencies, insecure non-formal work, and much violence within and outside their domestic environments. While differentiating itself from many other peri-urban areas because of its history of black land ownership, Winterfell resembles many of them in both its lack of infrastructure and levels of poverty. It is estimated that nearly 75% of those living in the area are not engaged in regular paid work, and of those employed, 50% are involved in informal sector activities. One of my first major activities in Winterfell was to conduct a micro-survey of about 300 women in a demarcated part of my fieldwork site. I learned that over 50% of all women were not earning any money, and 86% suggested that they needed support from others for economic survival. The micro-survey also revealed that while the number of children born to women aged 15 to 50 years ranged from none to 13, on average most women had 2 or 3 children. Older women tended to talk in terms of 5 children being the ideal, but younger women really expressed a desire to bear more than 2 children. In line with this, a very large proportion of women, about 70%, in the initial stages of my fieldwork, were using contraception to prevent childbearing or to postpone it indefinitely. For women under the age of 25, 76 of those with primary school education and 85% with high school education were using contraception. This latter percentage included women who had completed high school, as well as those who were in high school at the time. Nonetheless, irrespective of educational level, contraceptive use can be argued to be unusually widespread for a resource-challenged, impoverished area such as Winterfell. Throughout the period of my fieldwork, numerous explanations were offered for this declining commitment to bearing children. A central explanation was that marriage or other stable unions were becoming less common. In the group sessions, some of the younger women, many of whom had already had babies, maintained that they preferred not to marry and that they would rather live alone with their children. Unemployment and poor economic means were commonly cited as the main reason why women were reluctant to bear children. Early experiences of abuse at the hands of men were also factors which women suggested made them reluctant to enter into a union and bear children, especially if there were possibilities of mistreatment or if it was doubtful that the union would last. In addition, the costs of bringing up children and low expectations of adult children reciprocating economically in the long run were very frequently raised during the group sessions and during interviews with individual women. It was also apparent that the high rates of unemployment in recent years had led to a situation where younger people were becoming increasingly dependent on their parents' pensions for survival. So the magnitude and direction of wealth flows was predominantly from the older to the younger generations. In a community enduring economic insecurity, this scenario entrenches perceptions that children are likely to be a drain on the stretched resources of the individual and household. At the same time, finding employment or a caring relationship of some kind which secured greater financial well-being sometimes led to women talking about children becoming more affordable. Having another child might become a fairly immediate need for a woman who has delayed having additional children in the belief that she could not properly support them. Thus, it was common to see women bear a second child about 8 to 10 years after the first child was born. At a superficial level, some credence can be given to diffusionist and economic arguments relating to the appropriate number of children to bear. Such decision-making, however, should not be read simplistically and has to be understood as shaped and constructed by broader experiences of crisis and dilemmas facing women in their everyday lives. The women's narratives have suggested that marital unions do not last and that they are regularly undermined by violence, accusations of infidelity, and disputes of various kinds, and that many women bear children in several types of unions at different points in their lives. In the early stages of my fieldwork, I did not anticipate that the issue of violence would emerge so strongly in the stories of women. Increasingly, however, the stories of violence and their link to the breakup of relationships and instability of households became evident. 30 of the 33 women whose life histories I initially constructed talked about violence threatening the strength of their unions, and in a number of cases breaking them down completely. Some women talked about the experience of rape and sexual abuse, and the way in which these experiences had shaped their ideas about men and marriage. People living in environments experiencing high levels of poverty and insecurity are often rescued in part by familial support networks and by grandparents who might assume the role of parent for their grandchildren. The meanings attached to child fosterage and the circulation of children between the homes of their parents, grandparents, and other kin, and the implication of child circulation for future fertility considerations have been raised regularly by anthropological demographers. However, in both the focus groups and life histories, there were clear indications that, while many elderly women do help to support daughters and daughters-in-law with respect to childcare, a significant number of them are resistant to reducing their lives to mere childminders. It is not suggested that women do not have recourse to their kin for child-rearing and childcare, but that the stresses of poverty often intervene to undermine normative expectations and the reliability of networks. So in this sense, I concur with Seekings, who writes that in South Africa, kinship has ceased to be binding, and the obligations considered inescapable in the past are now often negotiable. Across much of South Africa, claims on paternal kin have declined dramatically, and maternal kin recognize a narrower range of responsibilities than in the past. This is not a new revelation. With respect to forms of neighborly support, Yowich, writing about Winterfell 30 years ago in the area of forced removals, claimed that it would seem that in Winterfell, the fear and insecurity that characterize life has in many cases led to the creation of a cutthroat mentality. Women do not trust, speak to, or help neighbors. The lack of social support networks, both familial and friendship, in a context of insecure, fluid, and often violent unions, appears to place considerable pressure on women to weigh the benefits of reproduction against the risks of poverty and marital dissolution. The inability to find a secure means to earn a living against the backdrop of vacillating relationships and weakened kinship bonds presents what Listager suggests are frustrated aspirations driven by a general decline in opportunities and conditions for working class men and women. Daily struggles to survive have increased awareness of the various implications of bringing up children. In Caldwell's wealth flows theory, lowered fertility is an indication of the progressive nucleation of families, as the costs of children become higher than their anticipated productive contributions to the household economy. Despite acknowledging responses to the burden of costs, it would be difficult to argue that families in my Winterfell fieldwork site are becoming nucleated or necessarily child-centered in the sense suggested by the Caldwells. The younger women in my stories have borne smaller numbers of children, but remain primarily a part of female-headed households or fragmented extended families. Given signs of child neglect, such as limited feeding, late entry into schools, early end to schooling, and so on, the movement towards smaller numbers of children do not appear to be altruistic attempts to ensure quantity-quality trade-offs, as rationalistic discourse would suggest, but is in a sense a woman-centered response to economic exigencies and multiple insecurities. The fact that life circumstances for most women in Winterfell are not improving but remain harsh offers some credence to Listager's views on how living with economic hardship over lengthy periods of time results in definite attempts by women to limit and control their reproductive lives. Rather than smaller family size being associated with signs of upward economic and social mobility, the sub-narrative emerging is that it is firmly linked in sectors of Winterfell to resistance to poverty. In their recent work on fertility rates and population decline, Benton and Newell suggest that we are witnessing the avoidance of marriage in sub-Saharan Africa, and this can be understood in terms of differing gendered perspectives on marital roles, with women's efforts to pursue a better life often in conflict with marriage and childbearing. There is evidence to show that while some women will seek marriage partners or resourced companions as a route out of financial troubles, an increasing number of women are now doing the opposite, avoiding marriage and seeing this as a crucial survival strategy. This trend has been evident since the 1960s. In his inaugural lecture, delivered in 1979 at Rhodes University, Michael Wisson asserted that women were able to opt out of the traditional order of society because a matrifocal cell, a women, children, and visiting men, was becoming economically viable. This sub-narrative of matrifocality and depressed desires for children raised questions about men, their absence, and their changing place in South African families. A key theme in contemporary South African literature on masculinities is what is popularly referred to as a crisis of masculinity and its impact on male identity and action. This more broadly references the ways in which masculinities respond to wider social processes, including responses to the ways in which historical patriarchies are upset and challenged through social change. One key argument is that men are in trouble, responding with difficulty to contemporary social change, as evidenced in health-related, psychological, and work-related problems. It is argued that men are enduring confusion and uncertainty in these times of considerable change. The idea that masculinities are responding to social change and that established and hegemonic forms of masculinity are being contested is an important current insight. It recognizes the variability of masculinity, its complex hierarchies, and the possibilities for its revisioning. The crisis of masculinity thesis, however, is highly problematic. The phrase conjures up an image of a stable, conventional masculinity that has been disrupted by post-apartheid changes, including emancipated and disobedient women, implicitly assuming and yearning for a time when men were not in trouble. The masculinity in crisis argument has been strongly appropriated by anti-feminist discourses that imply the victimhood of men in the face of feminist advancements and undermine the ways in which women have been troubled and in crisis for some time, and still are. This may lead to government departments seeking spaces to rekindle men's involvement in familial and reproductive decision-making without properly recognizing the circumstances of women or their attitudes on this matter. For example, in recognition of father absence and the need to strengthen the family, new state policy seeks to restore familial and marital bonds to the extent that abused women who have sought their freedom are encouraged to return to and remain with their partners. Through exploring reproductive motivations and practices in Winterfell, I have become more aware of the transitory nature of relationships and of the household as a female-centered domain and a key site of immense stress and gender struggle. Households without the daily presence of men are common, and the general experience of poverty keeps familial bonds fragile and subject to the constant threat of dissolution. A number of studies have argued that greater understanding is needed about how reproductive decisions are made, whether these decisions can be seen to be stable fertility goals, and the extent to which they reflect power differentials and contestations in the domestic domain. By repeatedly asking women questions about their choices and preferences over the years, I have learnt that original positions are malleable, particularly when economic circumstances shift favorably or when women enter into more secure relationships. The fluidity of the decision-making processes is thus contingent on the simultaneous interplay of numerous constraints and women's actions to contend with them in gaining more control over the various facets of their lives. There are a number of factors, apart from affordability, that intervene in taking the simple choice out of women's hands, and the most obvious of these is reduced fecundity as a result of infection and poor nutrition. While women did not talk much about HIV/AIDS with any great urgency in the early period of my fieldwork, by 2008, the rapid increase in deaths was raising concern. The spread of HIV/AIDS is an additional factor cited by scholars as potentially steering parts of sub-Saharan Africa away from a classic fertility transition. The rollout of ARVs over the past 5 years has helped restore some stability, but it has not boosted confidence sufficiently to generate changed attitudes towards fertility. An alternative argument favoring the logic of a hardship-driven fertility transition rather than one influenced primarily by improved socioeconomic conditions seems appropriate to my fieldwork Winterfell site. Admittedly, such an argument deserves repeated interrogation and can only be crafted after consistent and long-term study of women's lives and decision-making. Thus, notions of women's agency, responses to cumulative and traumatic life experiences and emotions need to find a place in analysis of fertility. So to conclude, through the efforts of feminists of the 1980s and 1990s, we have come to acknowledge that women can hardly be viewed in terms of a unified, homogeneous group. African scholars have also questioned the category of African women and the assumptions of similarity built into it. Instead, there has been recognition of cross-cutting differentiations in sub-Saharan Africa, given the intersections of class, ethnicity, sexuality, place of origin, history, religious affiliation, and other factors, such as whether or not women have been exposed to conditions of war or extreme adversity. These differentiations are usually masked in broad-based representations of changing fertility. Various kinds of feminisms and contesting tools and models of gendered analysis can be drawn upon in the course of demographic research, They can enhance our understanding of global population trends, the factors that affect fertility on different continents, and the local patterns shaping age of entry into sexual unions, use of contraception, and marriage rates. Through being sensitized to debates on gender from across the disciplines, demographers might infuse new energy into their theorizing and lead what is currently a productive but conventional demography into a critical direction. A critical demography would probe gendered and power inequalities, would question state decisions and actions, and examine the intricacies of social contexts, as well as the politics and subjectivities of demographers. A renewed focus would factor in more strongly women's struggles with daily crises. The life histories of both older and younger women in my research indicate that while family life has always been subject to various kinds of pressure, the structure of households and support networks have been severely challenged through increasing marginalization and neglect in post-apartheid informal settlements. Women have been central to struggles for services, have set up gardens to generate independent livelihoods, and have challenged councillors who have failed to deliver to their communities. They have been part of community policing forums and are increasingly mobilizing as vigilantes to root out perpetrators of violence and bring them to justice. Many of them have instituted court orders against their partners, inhibiting further violence, and have adopted resourceful strategies to confront economic troubles. The engagement with domestic violence and economic insecurity, to my mind, combines to make a hypothesis of crisis-led or hardship-driven fertility transition particularly relevant for Winterfell and similar areas. At its most basic level, it relies on frustrated aspirations because of expectations of changes in life circumstances, but continuing experience of stagnant or declining opportunities. Women in Winterfell who have lived with uncertainties and insecurities in the past continue to live with disappointments and unmet expectations of social and economic change in the present. In this space, families and networks resist child-rearing responsibilities, especially when compensation is not forthcoming and when they have their own financial stresses to contend with. Dependency of children on female incomes is intensifying a sense of crisis for women, leading to rethinking about fertility and what constitutes family. It cannot be argued, however, that the incipient decline in fertility in South Africa is largely a consequence of struggle against poverty and hardship. Different factors, some associated with economic improvement and middle-class lifestyles and aspirations, are clearly operating to shape the general picture of lowered fertility. Central to a more critical and informed study of reproduction, however, and to an understanding of what these different factors are, would be the need to broaden perspectives on the conditions of women's lives and the way these conditions lead to the adoption of particular strategies and modes of operating. Conceptual approaches in African demographic studies are often not easily accessible to notions of women's agency or how women's actions might influence relationships or circumstances through different, sometimes almost invisible ways. Paying close attention to these actions and the political and social constraints configuring them will be essential in developing more complex and deeply gendered alternative sub-narratives of transforming reproductive and familial dynamics in South Africa. Well, thank you.
I think I should start by expressing my gratitude to Professor Naidoo and the university for inviting me to serve as a respondent to this inaugural lecture. Professor Naidoo is a colleague that I've known within the South African sociological circle for several years, and it's a delight and a privilege to serve in this position. Professor Naidoo, your elevation to the position of a full professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg is well deserved. And I would like to congratulate you again for the promotion and welcome you to the professoriate. The matter on which Professor Naidoo has addressed us tonight is a serious one indeed. From the point of view of public policy and social justice. It is a fascinating field of study from the perspective of knowledge production and insight into the micro processes that shape women's fertility decisions and fertility transitions broadly in society. Let me address the second part first. The work presented here by Professor Naidoo demonstrates the value of local level and sustained field research in a single location over a period of 16 years. The sustained ethnographic study of the group of women allows for both depth and breadth of analysis, drawing on very rich data, reflecting on the women who are themselves growing older with time. But it is rich ethnographic data that arches back to reasoning with data in a way that intervenes in the global debate on fertility transitions and how we explain the processes at the heart of micro-level decision-making. In this, Professor Naidoo eminently demonstrates our contributions to the field of social demography broadly and fertility transition specifically. The bigger story is how in this corner of South Africa in northern Gauteng province, fertility transition is hardship driven. This is hardship that is product of specific geography of oppression, broader social violence, specific gender violence, economic deprivation, and family disintegration. The fertility decisions for smaller number of children reflect the agency of women in the midst of cumulative and traumatic life experiences. The textured explorations of the women's lives, agency, and struggle to give coherence to their lives in the context of an ongoing social trauma provides us rare insight into a matter of important public and academic interest. As Professor Naidoo noted, this is one explanation for fertility transition in South Africa. It is by no means the only one. The value of this type of work is to throw light on hidden social processes at play in explaining overall national trends. That behind the seemingly uniform processes of overall fertility, total fertility decline, there are different explanations. The one from the extended field data is one of hardship and social trauma, not sunshine middle class decision making on the number of children to have. A subsidiary story, at least one that I would like to highlight, relates to the issue of teenage pregnancy. Again, against the grain of the urban legend of increased teenage pregnancy in the context of child support grants, the data from the field that Professor Naidoo presents again demonstrate the extent to which, even in these deprived areas, and I quote, the questions of teenage pregnancy continue to elicit negative responses from both parents and teenagers alike. Other studies show that not only has total fertility declined, but young mothers under 20 are less likely to claim child support grants than mothers 25 years and older. Let me end by returning to the issue of public policy and social justice that I raised earlier. What Professor Naidoo's research demonstrates is the enduring legacy of apartheid on the one hand, and how much gap there is in our current public policy. Winterfell and the utter deprivation that we come across in the data set are products of apartheid geography that has taken on a structural dimension in blightening the lives of the residents in an ongoing environment of social trauma, gender-based violence, traumatized gendered lives, and extensive socioeconomic deprivations are manifestations of these legacies. But the fact that there has not been significant structural shift or transformation of environments, such as Winterfell, for instance, points to the level of public policy failure over the last 20 years. Yet, the study site is only one of thousands across the length and breadth of the country. The challenge of such privation calls for leadership across the whole of society. Our freedom, I will argue, has to be measured by how far we can claim
to have moved from the deprivation and social trauma that ravages communities such as Winterfell. This is where we must emphasize the research policy nexus and our roles as academics in meeting these social challenges. The Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Naidoo, thank you again for the invitation to serve as a respondent, and to you again, welcome to the Professoriate.
Ladies and gentlemen, the university is full of traditions. Not only did we have to ask Professor Naidoo to sing for her inauguration into the academia and the professoriate, but she also has to dress the part and look the part. So the part that we now is to officially gown Professor. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, warm congratulations to Professor Naidoo and a formal welcome to her into the Distinguished Hall of Fame.